There are at least 7 employees who walk past him every single day. They step around his slumped figure, avoid his eyes, and hurry through the glass doors of the corporate tower he himself built. For one full week, the billionaire CEO has been disguised as a homeless man, sitting silently outside his own headquarters. He is conducting a final, devastating test of character, and the results are about to dismantle everything he thought he knew about loyalty. His name is David Vance, founder and sole owner of Vance Solutions, a tech empire valued at nearly $4 billion. He has built a culture preaching integrity and community, but a gnawing suspicion tells him it's all a facade. This is not a reality television stunt. It is a private, desperate audit of the human souls inside his gleaming tower. And when the experiment concludes, only one person will have passed his test, a young woman he had already marked for termination. What she does next will expose a truth far more dangerous than simple indifference. David Vance did not build his empire by being naive. He started in a garage 2 decades ago, coding through the night, fueled by a belief that a company should be a family. By his 50th birthday, Vance Solutions dominated the cloud security market with over 2,000 employees and a campus featuring a climbing wall and organic cafeterias. But a series of anonymous letters to his private office shattered that idyllic image. They detailed petty thefts from supply closets, cruel hazing of interns, and managers turning a blind eye to bullying. The culture he championed was, according to these letters, a lie. The final straw was a confidential HR report on his desk. It recommended the termination of an entire low-level accounting team for consistent minor errors. At the top of that list was the name Sarah Chen. The report cited a lack of engagement and a negative attitude, but David had a different suspicion. He believed Sarah's team was being scapegoated by a middle manager covering up a larger financial discrepancy. He couldn't prove it with data. He needed to see the character of his people, unfiltered, when they thought the boss wasn't watching. The plan was drastic. He enlisted only his retired security chief, a man he trusted with his life, to help with the disguise. They used professional theater-grade makeup to add layers of grime and simulated sun damage. They sourced worn, thrifted clothing, but David made one deliberate mistake. He kept on his own $700 dress shoes, polished to a shine beneath the frayed cuffs of his pants. It was a test within a test. Would anyone look closely enough to see the contradiction? On a cold Monday morning in November, David Vance, billionaire, became Dan, a man who had lost his construction job and was now sleeping rough. His security chief dropped him off a block from the main Vance Solutions tower. David took his position on a low concrete planter, a stained blanket over his shoulders, a cardboard sign leaning against his knee. The first employee to pass by was Michael Torrance, the head of sales, a man whose bonus last year exceeded $2 million. Michael was on the phone, laughing. He walked within 3 feet of David, didn't break his conversation, and pushed through the revolving door. Next came a group of junior developers, clutching their artisan coffees. One of them, a young man in a Vance Solutions hoodie, glanced over. "Dude, that's brutal," he muttered to his friend, and they quickened their pace. Throughout the day, David tracked the patterns. The senior executives, the ones who sat in plush offices on the top floors, were the most adept at avoidance. They mastered the art of looking through a person as if they were glass. The mid-level managers were hurried, stressed, their eyes glued to their phones. A few of the youngest interns looked genuinely distressed, but they were shepherded along by their peers, social pressure overriding compassion. By Wednesday, a routine had set in. The morning rush was a parade of averted gazes. The lunch hour brought a different kind of cruelty. A group from marketing, eating gourmet sandwiches on a bench nearby, complained loudly about the eyesore affecting the corporate image. David wrote down their names, his heart hardening. But then there was Sarah Chen. Each morning, she exited the bus stop across the plaza. She was 28, with her dark hair in a practical ponytail, her wardrobe a rotation of simple blouses and skirts. On Tuesday, she had paused, her eyes meeting his for just a second too long before she looked down and hurried inside. On Wednesday, she did the same, but this time she was carrying a large tote bag that seemed heavy. On Thursday morning, it happened. As a sharp wind cut across the plaza, David watched Sarah approach. She stopped directly in front of him. Her expression wasn't one of pity, but of focused concern. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I brought you this. It's supposed to get colder tonight." From her tote bag, she pulled out a thick gray wool blanket, still in its packaging. It was clearly new. She then held out a thermos. "It's just tea, but it's hot." David, as Dan, took the items, mumbling a thanks. Sarah didn't linger for praise. She simply nodded and walked toward the building. David's mind raced. The blanket was a Advanced Solutions branded promotional item, likely from a storage closet. The thermos was plain, but the gesture was undeniably, authentically human. According to the HR file, this was the disengaged employee with a negative attitude. Yet, she was the only one who saw a person in need, not a problem to be ignored. That evening, David's security chief picked him up at the designated spot. In the privacy of the car, David scrolled through Sarah's full employee record. Her performance reviews were solid for 2 years, then dipped sharply 6 months ago, coinciding with the promotion of her new department head, a man named Richard Bell. Bell's own file was pristine, a fast-rising star known for cutting costs. David cross-referenced the anonymous letters. One of them mentioned a tyrant in accounting who created false deadlines to force errors, then used those errors to fire veterans and replace them with cheaper, temporary contractors. The letter didn't name Richard Bell, but the pattern was identical. David felt a cold fury. His experiment was revealing a rot he never anticipated. It wasn't just a lack of kindness. It was a systemic cruelty engineered for profit by one of his own managers. And the one person, with the integrity to help a stranger, was being railroaded out of the company for it. On Friday, the final day of the experiment, David arrived at his spot with a new resolve. He would end the charade today. He would call Sarah down, reveal himself, and expose the truth. But fate intervened in a way he never expected. At noon, as the plaza filled with employees enjoying the sunshine, a different scene unfolded. Richard Bell, Sarah's manager, strode out of the building with 2 security guards. They weren't heading for David. They were heading for Sarah, who was sitting on a bench eating a sandwich alone. From 20 feet away, David watched, hidden in his disguise, as Bell pointed a finger at Sarah, his voice carrying across the open space. "Chen, we've just confirmed the discrepancy. You can clear out your desk. You're done." Sarah stood up, her face pale. "That's impossible. I didn't take anything," she protested. Bell smirked. "The audit trail doesn't lie. Security will escort you." As the guards moved to flank her, David Vance knew his week on the streets was over. But the real battle for the soul of his company was just beginning, and it was starting with a very public firing on the plaza he owned. Every instinct in David's body screamed to stand up, to rip off the filthy coat and shout his name. But a colder, more calculating part of him held back. He needed to see how this played out. He needed to witness the full mechanism of the corruption he'd suspected. From his perch on the planter, he watched as Sarah Chen, her back straight, refused to be led away quietly. "You can escort me to my desk, Richard," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the quieting plaza. "But you will not touch me, and you will explain this discrepancy to me with proof in front of HR." Richard Bell's smug expression flickered. This wasn't in the script. The low-level employees he usually bullied went quietly. Sarah's defiance was drawing eyes. Dozens of employees on their lunch break had stopped to watch. A public spectacle was bad for business. Bell tried to regain control. "This isn't a debate, Chen. The evidence is conclusive. Now move along, or we'll have you removed for trespassing." One of the security guards, a man named Jeff, who David recognized from the overnight shift, shifted uncomfortably. He knew the CEO's stance on treating employees with dignity. This felt wrong. That's when David moved. He didn't stand up with a grand announcement. He simply rose from his seated position, letting the old blanket fall, and began walking toward the group. His movement was slow, deliberate. He was just a homeless man, after all, shuffling across the corporate plaza. Bell saw him first, his face twisting in fresh irritation. "Not now, pal, beat it." David kept walking until he was standing beside Sarah. He looked at her, and for the first time he spoke to her not as a stranger, but as her employer. "Sarah, thank you for the blanket and the tea." His voice was different. The gravelly affectation was gone, replaced by the calm, authoritative tone that had commanded boardrooms for 20 years. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She knew that voice from the all-hands meetings broadcast across the company. David then turned to Richard Bell. He reached up and pulled off the greasy, gray-streaked wig, then began rubbing at the makeup on his face with the sleeve of his torn coat. The transformation was grotesque and mesmerizing. The grime smeared, revealing clean skin beneath. The posture of defeat straightened into one of immense power. "Richard," David said, his eyes like ice, "you're fired." Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. The silence in the plaza was absolute. You could hear the distant hum of traffic. Richard Bell stared, his mouth slightly open, his brain refusing to process the image. The billionaire CEO was standing before him in rags. The homeless man he'd instructed maintenance to shoo away for the past 3 days was David Vance. The blood drained from Bell's face, leaving a sickly white pallor. "Mr. Vance, this is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "The only misunderstanding," David interrupted, his voice now loud enough for every onlooker to hear, "was my belief that managers like you represented my company's values. You are a cancer in this organization." "Jeff," he said, turning to the security guard, "please see Mr. Bell to his office to collect his personal items. He is not to access his computer. Then escort him from the property." The power dynamic had irrevocably flipped. Jeff, now with clear, righteous orders, stepped forward. "Right away, sir. Mr. Bell, come with me." As Bell was led away, sputtering protests, David turned his attention to the crowd. Hundreds of his employees were watching, their phones discreetly recording. The story would be on social media within minutes. He had just detonated a bomb at the heart of his own company's culture. He looked back at Sarah. Her initial shock was hardening into something else, a wary understanding. She had been an unwitting participant in a secret test. The kindness she'd shown wasn't to a stranger, but to her all-powerful boss. David saw the hurt in her eyes. "Sarah, I owe you an enormous apology and an explanation. Please, come inside with me." He didn't wait for a reply. He started walking toward the main entrance, the sea of employees parting before him. The CEO, in a torn coat, his face streaked with makeup, marching back into his glass palace. Sarah, after a moment's hesitation, followed. They didn't go to the executive suites. David led her to a small, secure conference room on the ground floor, often used for sensitive legal meetings. His security chief was already there, holding a change of clothes. "Give us 10 minutes, David said. After quickly changing into the crisp shirt and trousers, washing the remainder of the makeup from his face, he returned to the room where Sarah waited, silent and tense. "Before you say anything," David began, sitting across from her, "know that the test was never about you. It was about them, about us asterisk. I've been receiving anonymous letters for months describing a toxic culture, bullying and fraud. My own HR department seemed either oblivious or complicit. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. What I saw out there," he gestured toward the plaza, "was a failure of humanity. But in you, I saw its redemption. You were on a list to be fired, Sarah, a list generated by Richard Bell." Sarah took a deep breath. The initial shock was giving way to a fierce, intelligent anger. "So my job was saved because I gave a homeless man a blanket? What about my work? What about the errors on my record that aren't my errors?" This was the opening David needed. "Tell me about the errors," he said, leaning forward. For the next hour, Sarah laid out a systematic pattern of sabotage. Richard Bell would give her team incomplete data sets for monthly reconciliations, set impossible deadlines, and then reject their requests for clarification. When the inevitable minor discrepancies arose, a missing invoice number, a miscoded expense, he would magnify them into cases of gross incompetence or, as of today, implied theft. He had already forced out 2 other veteran team members this way, replacing them with underqualified contractors from a staffing agency he personally recommended. "We all knew it was wrong," Sarah said, her voice trembling with pent-up frustration. "But who were we supposed to tell? HR reports to him. The anonymous letters, those were from my former coworker, Janet. She tried to go to the hotline, but nothing happened. She was so scared, she quit and moved out of state." David's security chief, who had been monitoring the building systems, knocked and entered. "So we've isolated Bell's computer. As you suspected, there's a hidden folder with spreadsheets. It's not just about padding his budget with cheap labor." He placed a tablet in front of David. The spreadsheets showed a sophisticated shell game. Bell had been creating false vendor accounts and funneling small, recurring payments into them, payments designed to look like legitimate service charges. The amounts were carefully kept below thresholds that would trigger automatic audits. Over the last 18 months, he had siphoned off over $400,000. The errors he pinned on Sarah's team were related to these very accounts. They were the ones trying to reconcile the phantom charges, and their confusion was his perfect cover. David felt a surge of vindication mixed with profound disgust. His experiment had uncovered not just a moral failure, but a criminal one. Get legal and forensic accounting in here, now. And I want Bell's personal financials, his connections to that staffing agency, everything. He turned back to Sarah. You have just helped expose a significant fraud. I am reinstating you and your entire team with full back pay for any lost wages. And your title is now Acting Director of Accounting, reporting directly to me until we clean this up. Sarah looked stunned. Director, Mr. Vance, I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me fix this, David replied. You have the integrity this place desperately needs, but I have to ask, when you saw me out there, why did you stop? No one else did. Sarah was quiet for a moment. My parents ran a small grocery store. We weren't rich. I watched them give food to people who had nothing, even when business was slow. They taught me that a person's circumstance is not their character. You looked cold and alone. It was a simple human response. It shouldn't be a remarkable one. Her answer humbled him more than any boardroom defeat ever had. The news of the CEO's week undercover and the dramatic firing exploded across the company like a shockwave. By the end of the day, the story was trending on business and social media channels. The narrative was irresistible. Billionaire CEO poses as homeless, fires manager who fired kind employee. But inside Vance Solutions, the atmosphere was one of sheer panic and paranoia. Who else had walked past the boss? Who had said something cruel? The anonymous letter writer, emboldened, sent a new message directly to David's restored email. It's bigger than Bell. He was the frontman. The money didn't stop with him. David convened an emergency meeting with his head of legal, his security chief, and a pale, nervous head of HR. The HR director, a woman named Linda, had signed off on Bell's termination recommendations without deeper review. Under David's intense questioning, she broke down. She admitted Bell had implied the orders to streamline the accounting department came from the top. She assumed he meant the CFO, a man named Robert Hill. Robert Hill was a founding-era executive, David's old friend, and the keeper of the company's most sensitive financial secrets. If he was involved, the corruption was at the highest level. David refused to believe it. Robert was like a brother. They'd weathered near bankruptcy together in the early years, but the evidence was a compass needle pointing in one terrifying direction. The fake vendors required high-level accounting codes to be established. The staffing agency contract, while initiated by Bell, had been approved by the procurement department, which reported to Hill. The money trail, once followed, might lead right to the CFO's office. David faced an impossible choice. Confront his most trusted friend based on the accusation of an anonymous whistleblower and the scheming of a disgraced middle manager, or risk allowing a potential viper to remain in the heart of his company's finances. He decided on a different approach. He would use the public momentum of his undercover week to announce a sweeping, company-wide amnesty and culture review. He would call it the integrity audit. Any employee who came forward with information about misconduct without fear of retaliation would be protected and could even receive a reward. It was a gamble. It might flush out the truth, or it might drown him in a flood of grievances and false accusations. He scheduled a live, all-hands address for the next morning. As he prepared his speech, his security chief delivered another piece of information. Richard Bell, upon being escorted to his home, had not unpacked. He had loaded a single suitcase into his car and driven away. His phone was off. He was in the wind, and the forensic team had just discovered something chilling on his secured laptop. A single encrypted email, received 2 weeks prior with the subject line, Containment Protocol. The sender's address was untraceable, but the metadata suggested it was sent from inside the Vance Solutions corporate network. Someone had warned Bell that the walls were closing in. Someone who was still inside the building, watching David's every move, and who was now preparing to protect themselves at any cost. The Containment Protocol email was a ghost, sent from a server node that should have been dormant, using credentials that had been revoked 6 months prior. It was a digital sleight of hand, but its message was clear. Richard Bell had a protector, someone with deep technical access and a vested interest in keeping him quiet. David stood before his entire company the next morning via live stream, the image of the humble, penitent leader. He announced the integrity audit, promising amnesty and protection for whistleblowers. The address was hailed in the press as a masterstroke in transparent leadership. Inside the tower, it triggered a silent earthquake. The secure portal for submissions went live at noon. Within the first hour, it received over 200 anonymous reports. Not all were about Bell or financial fraud. They painted a picture of a culture rotting from the middle out: favoritism, gender discrimination, withheld commissions, mental health bullying. David had opened a floodgate of pain, and he was morally obligated to see it through. But his security team was focused on one thread: following the money Bell had stolen. Forensic accounting, working with Sarah Chen, made the critical connection. The fake vendor accounts didn't just siphon money out, they also funneled money *in from an external, untraceable source. It was a laundering operation. Bell was using Vance Solutions, legitimate payment systems, to clean dirty money, taking a hefty fee for the service. The $400,000 he stole was just his commission. The total amount that had flowed through these shadow accounts was over $12 million. This wasn't embezzlement. It was a criminal enterprise operating inside a Fortune 500 company, and the sophistication of the digital cover-up pointed to internal help far beyond a greedy middle manager. David confronted his CFO, Robert Hill, in a private meeting. He presented the initial findings, watching his old friend's face carefully. Robert, a man with a famously calm demeanor, turned ashen. "David, this is insane. I had no idea. These systems have automated controls. For this to happen, someone would need to," he trailed off, his financial mind racing through the possibilities. "They'd need my override codes or something that mimics them." He looked genuinely horrified, not guilty. He immediately volunteered his full financial records and device history for audit. David wanted to believe him. The forensic techs, however, found something troubling. While no direct evidence linked Hill to the fraud, his administrative credentials had been used to grant temporary system-level access to the accounting servers on 3 key dates that coincided with the creation of the largest fake vendors. The logs showed the access originated from Hill's office computer. Robert swore he never authorized it. He claimed his computer was often left unlocked, and his assistant had access for scheduling. The assistant, a meticulous woman named Evelyn who had been with Robert for 15 years, was brought in for questioning. She was nervous but adamant. She never touched his computer for system access, but she remembered something. On one of those dates, Robert had been in an all-day off-site leadership retreat. The entire C-suite was out of the building. The only person who came by the office that day, Evelyn said, thinking hard, was Mr. Vance's executive assistant, Martin. He said he needed to borrow a proprietary cable to connect a presentation laptop. He was in the office for maybe 2 minutes. Martin Cole had been David's right hand for a decade. He managed David's life, his schedule, his travel, his confidential correspondence. He was the gatekeeper. If there was one person in the company who could move unseen, who had universal respect and access, it was Martin. The idea was unthinkable. Martin was loyalty personified. He was the one who had helped David's security chief plan the homeless disguise, sourcing the clothes and the makeup artist. He was in on the secret from the start. David felt the ground crumble beneath him. The conspiracy wasn't just in accounting or finance. It was in his own inner sanctum. He reviewed the security footage from Hill's office on that day. There was Martin entering with a friendly wave to Evelyn, walking into Robert's empty office and emerging less than 90 seconds later. It was perfectly plausible, but now every innocent action looked sinister. Why did the containment protocol email originate from a dead server that only Martin, as the de facto head of executive IT support, could realistically reactivate? David's mind raced back to the anonymous letters. They started arriving after Martin helped implement a new, more secure internal mail system. Could he have been filtering them, only letting through enough to seem credible, but not enough to point to the real scheme? The purpose of the fraud suddenly snapped into a new, terrifying focus. It wasn't just for personal enrichment. $12 million in laundered money was working capital. For what? Sarah Chen, now digging through the forensic data with the zeal of someone fighting for her professional life, found the answer. She identified a pattern in the outgoing wire transfers from the fake vendors. A significant portion of the cleaned funds was being sent to a shell company registered in Delaware. That shell company, she discovered through painstaking public record searches, had quietly been purchasing small blocks of Vance Solutions stocked through anonymous brokerage accounts over the past 18 months. Someone was using the stolen and laundered money to slowly, secretly buy up shares of the company. This was a long-term, hostile takeover strategy from within. They were using David's own money, filtered through his own company, to finance a coup against him. And the orchestrator needed someone with a CEO's trust, a CFO's systems access, and a manager on the ground to manipulate the books. They needed a triad. Confronting Martin directly was too risky. He knew everything: David's personal security protocols, his family schedules, his weakest points. Instead, David, with his security chief, set a trap. They fabricated a piece of highly sensitive, false information, a memo stating that David, shaken by the scandal, was considering taking the company private in a leveraged buyout, which would crush the value of the common stock. They placed this memo in a secure digital folder to which only Martin had access, rigged with a digital tracer. Within 4 hours, the tracer pinged. The document was accessed, and its contents were copied and encrypted before being sent to an external server linked to the same Delaware shell company. Martin was the leak. He was the central hub. The amiable, indispensable assistant was a spy. The revelation was a personal betrayal that dwarfed the financial crimes. This man had arranged David's daughter's college tour. He'd consoled him after his divorce. David realized with chilling clarity that the entire undercover boss experiment may have been manipulated. Did Martin steer him toward the disguise idea, knowing it would create chaos, distract from the financial trails, and expose only the low-level cultural rot that would make David look heroic while the real thieves worked in the shadows? The anonymous letters, the HR report on Sarah's team, all of it could have been stage-managed to guide David's gaze in the wrong direction. He had been a puppet in his own morality play. David ordered 24-hour surveillance on Martin. He also made a difficult call to Robert Hill. "I need you to act normally with Martin. We have to see who he talks to next. This goes deeper than him." Robert, now understanding the stakes, agreed. The next 72 hours were a tense game of corporate espionage. Martin was careful, but the surveillance saw him take an unusual, late-night meeting at a quiet suburban diner. The man he met was not Richard Bell. It was the company's head of strategic acquisitions, a brilliant, ambitious executive named Daniel Priestley. Priestley was the architect of Vance Solutions' most aggressive mergers. He understood corporate valuation, stock manipulation, and takeover law better than anyone. He was also, according to the shell company records, its sole beneficial owner. The puzzle was complete. Priestley provided the strategy and the financial markets expertise. Martin provided the insider access and the cloak of the CEO's authority. Bell provided the dirty hands in the accounting machinery to make the cash flow. Their plan wasn't just to steal money, it was to stealthily acquire enough stock to force a boardroom revolt, oust David, and install Priestley as the new CEO, with Martin as his chief of operations. They were building their own kingdom from the bones of his. David had the evidence, but taking it public would cause a catastrophic scandal. The stock would plummet, clients would flee, the company might not survive the reputational damage. He was trapped by the very empire he'd built. As he agonized over his next move, his security chief delivered the worst news yet. Richard Bell's car had been found abandoned at a remote coastal cliff. There was no sign of Bell, but his suitcase was in the trunk. The local police were treating it as a probable suicide. David knew better. Bell was the loose end. The containment protocol hadn't been about saving him, it had been about silencing him, and they had succeeded. Daniel Priestley and Martin Cole had just graduated from fraud and conspiracy to something much darker. They had shown they were willing to eliminate obstacles permanently. David Vance was now an obstacle. He had gone from testing his employees' character to fighting for his company's survival and perhaps for his own life. The game had changed. The time for internal audits and amnesty was over. Now it was war. David Vance did not call the police. Not yet. A public raid on his own headquarters would be the final nail in the company's coffin. Instead, he waged a silent, surgical corporate war. He called an emergency, in-person board meeting, excluding Daniel Priestley. To the gathered directors, he presented the forensic evidence: the money laundering, the stock acquisitions, the digital trails linking Priestley and Martin Cole. He played audio, captured by his security team, of Priestley at the diner outlining the takeover plan. The board, initially skeptical and fearful of scandal, was left with no choice. They voted unanimously to immediately terminate Daniel Priestley and Martin Cole for gross misconduct and refer the evidence to the authorities. But David added one condition: it would be done quietly. They would be escorted out for a violation of data security protocols. A bland public statement would be issued, and the full criminal investigation would proceed behind closed doors until arrests could be made without market panic. The next morning, as Priestley strode into his corner office and Martin set up David's daily briefing, they were met not by colleagues, but by security and a stoic representative from legal. Their network access was killed before they could touch a keyboard. Their personal phones were taken as evidence. They were marched out of the building through a private garage, their careers and freedom evaporating in a sterile, silent procession. The internal announcement was brief and bloodless. The external world noticed only a minor executive reshuffle, but inside, the shock was profound. The two most trusted men in the executive wing were gone in an instant. The message was clear: the CEO knew everything, and no one was safe. David then turned to the mountain of grievances from the integrity audit. He appointed Sarah Chen to lead a new office of ethical culture, reporting directly to the board. Her first task was to triage the reports, with a mandate to investigate every claim and implement real change. She hired external investigators and reformed HR from the ground up. Managers found to have bullied or discriminated were fired. Policies were rewritten to protect whistleblowers. The thick-skin bias that had allowed indifference to flourish was named and dismantled in mandatory training. The company, once a glossy facade, began the painful, authentic work of becoming the community David had always claimed it was. The legal proceedings unfolded over the following months. Daniel Priestley and Martin Cole were arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, securities fraud, and money laundering. Facing decades in prison, Martin, the loyal assistant, broke first. He cut a deal with prosecutors, providing full testimony against Priestley in exchange for a reduced sentence. He revealed that the plan was always about control. Priestley believed David had grown soft, that his people-first philosophy was costing shareholders. He saw the culture of fear Bell cultivated not as a bug, but as a useful tool to keep employees compliant. Richard Bell's disappearance remained officially unsolved, but the implication of foul play added a dark edge to the case that ensured Priestley would never see the outside of a cell again. David won. He saved his company. He exposed the villains. He installed a true moral compass in Sarah, but the victory felt hollow. The betrayal by Martin, a man he considered family, left a wound that no corporate success could heal. He had built an empire believing trust was the foundation, only to find it had been a stage set, manipulated from the wings. The week he spent on the streets, which started as a test for others, became his own brutal education. He saw the world through the eyes of the invisible, and he understood that his tower of glass and steel was, to most people, just another indifferent monolith. One evening, months after the turmoil had settled, David asked Sarah to join him for a walk across the now-empty plaza. The concrete planter where he'd sat was just a planter again. "I keep thinking about your question," David said. "You asked why you stopped to help when no one else did. You said it was a simple human response. But this whole company failed that simple test. I failed it for years by not looking closely enough." Sarah nodded quietly. They didn't see a person. They saw a problem, a risk, an inconvenience. A corporate environment teaches you to optimize away inconveniences. She paused. "But you saw it too in the end. You just needed a disguise to make it visible to yourself." Her words struck him with the force of truth. He had needed to become someone else to see his own kingdom clearly. The final, surprising detail of the entire saga was not in the court documents or the board minutes. It was in a small, framed photograph that David now kept on his desk, replacing a trophy from a major deal. It was a picture taken by his security chief from across the plaza that cold Thursday morning. It showed Sarah Chen, in her modest office wear, handing a thermos to a hunched, ragged figure on the planter. It was a moment of uncalculated grace. That single act, born of upbringing in a small grocery store, had unraveled a multi-million-dollar conspiracy and toppled a would-be corporate king. It proved that the most powerful force in business is not leverage or strategy or fear. It is ordinary human decency, which is paradoxically the rarest and most transformative commodity of all. David Vance never again disguised himself, but he walked the floors of his company differently. He knew the names of the janitors. He ate in the main cafeteria. He made the anonymous reporting system permanent and protected by law. The stock price, after an initial dip, rose steadily as clients and talent were drawn to a firm with a verified ethical backbone. Sarah Chen's Office of Ethical Culture became a model, studied by other corporations. The scandal was a wound, but the healing forged a stronger, more transparent organization. The story of the billionaire who went undercover as homeless leaked, of course, but the full, dark truth of the conspiracy remained known only to a few. The public narrative settled on a simpler, more satisfying moral: kindness is never wasted, and true character is revealed when no one is watching. David let that story stand, because in its essence, it was true. His experiment began with a test of character, and in the most unlikely person, at the very bottom of the corporate ladder, he found it in its purest form. He had set out to judge his employees and ended up being saved by one. The empire he built would now bear the imprint of that salvation, a monument not to his wealth, but to a lesson learned in humility on a cold, concrete planter. The journey from that lonely vigil to this moment of quiet resolution was complete. So what does this story leave us with? Beyond a compelling viral headline, it presents us with a stark, modern parable about the distance between our professed values and our lived actions. David Vance's experiment held up a mirror, and the reflection was uncomfortable. It revealed a workplace, a microcosm of society, where efficiency often trumps empathy, where the human instinct to help can be suppressed by corporate protocol, social fear, or simple self-absorption. The psychological thick-skin bias allowed his employees to rationalize walking past suffering, dehumanizing the person on the planter into a mere obstacle. Yet the same environment that bred that indifference also contained the precise integrity needed to save it. The conspiracy aimed at the heart of the company was sophisticated, leveraging greed, ambition, and digital stealth. The solution was ancient, simple, and cost the price of a blanket and a thermos. Sarah Chen did not act because she calculated a reward. She acted because her character, forged in a small grocery store, did not allow her to do otherwise. In the end, the most advanced security system, the most rigorous financial audit, was less effective than one person's uncompromised decency. David Vance learned that leadership is not about building a perfect system, but about fostering an environment where that decency can flourish and be recognized, not exploited or eliminated. The true legacy of his week in disguise is not the scandal he uncovered, but the culture he was forced to rebuild in its aftermath, a culture where seeing someone in need is the first step, not the last resort. This story challenges a core myth of the business world, that success requires a hardening of the heart. It suggests instead that the greatest strategic asset any organization possesses is the moral courage of its people. The next time you walk past someone the world has rendered invisible or face a choice between convenience and compassion, remember that the most powerful revolutions often begin with the smallest, quietest acts. What would your choice be? If this exploration of character and consequence resonated with you, share your thoughts below. For more deep dives into the human stories behind the headlines, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching.